Freedom Walkers, Chapter 4, Martin Luther King Jr. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and his wife Coretta were up before dawn on the morning of Monday, December 5th, 1955. Coretta sat at the living room window, watching for the first morning bus to arrive at the bus stop just down the street. It was usually filled with black maids on their way to work. Word of the boycott had been spreading through the city all that weekend. At their meeting on Friday evening, Montgomery's black ministers had drafted a leaflet of their own. Don't ride the bus to work, to town, to school, or anywhere on Monday, December 5th. If you work, take a cab or share a ride or walk. And on Sunday, at every black church in town, preachers called on their congregations to support the protest. No one knew if the boycott would be effective. Would Montgomery's black citizens unite and stay off the buses on that cold and overcast December morning? Or would they be intimidated by fears of white retaliation? At the Court Square bus shelter, a busy downtown stop, someone had posted a sign written on a piece of cardboard. People don't ride the buses today. Don't ride it for freedom. I was in the kitchen drinking my coffee when I heard Coretta cry, "Martin, Martin, come quickly," King wrote later. As I approached the front window, Coretta pointed joyfully to a slow-moving bus. "Darling, it's empty!" I could hardly believe what I saw. I knew that the South Jackson line, which ran past our house, carried more Negro passengers than any other line in Montgomery. Another empty bus appeared, then another one. An excited King jumped into his car and drove around town for the next hour, peering at every passing bus. "By this time, I was jubilant," he wrote. He knew now that the boycott was going to be a success. King was 26 years old and a newcomer to Montgomery. He had moved to the city with Coretta the year before to take his first job as a minister at the historic Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, which stood in the center of town across from the state capitol. He came from a family of eminent Southern Black preachers and civil rights activists. His father, Martin Luther King Sr., often called Daddy King, was a pastor at the huge Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, which had been founded in 1894 by Martin Jr.'s maternal grandfather, A.D. Williams. The first member of his family to be educated outside the South, Martin Jr. had earned a doctorate in the theology at Boston University, where he had a reputation as a great dancer and a lively young man about town. He met Coretta Scott, a Northern-educated, classically trained singer from Alabama, on a blind date and proposed to her soon afterward. King represented a new generation of African-American leaders, highly educated young men who would rise to prominence through the ministry at a time where there were few Black lawyers and when the usual political opportunities in city and state government were closed to Blacks in the South. That morning, the city's buses followed their usual runs, carrying just handfuls of white passengers. Trailing many of the near-empty buses were pairs of white-helmeted motorcycle policemen who had been assigned to protect Negro riders. Police Commissioner Clyde Sellers had charged that Negro goon squads intended to threaten Blacks who wanted to ride the buses. But the boycotters hadn't heard of any so-called goon squads, and Sellers' plan backfired. If there were any timid souls who would have ridden the bus despite the boycott, they were really frightened now, wrote Joanne Robinson, when these faint-hearted few saw heavily armed police trailing buses and keeping an eye on bus stops. They wanted no part of such a scene. On almost every street corner in the downtown area, Blacks stood waiting for taxi rides. E.D. Nixon had phoned each of Montgomery's 18 Black-owned taxi companies to ask for help. The companies had agreed to transport passengers for 10 cents each, the same fare people would pay on the bus, rather than the usual 45-cent minimum for a cab ride. Every taxi was packed with people on their way to their jobs. Crowds of others were walking to work, bundled up against the cold, carrying their lunches in brown paper bags. Some boycotters walked more than 20 miles to and from work that day. The few Negroes who boarded buses, reported a local Black historian, found it difficult to get off without being embarrassed by other Negroes who waited for taxis at bus stops throughout the city. Some were seen ducking in the aisles as the buses passed various stops. Several hundred people greeted Rosa Parks when she arrived at court later that Monday morning. The trial took all of 10 minutes, wrote Fred Gray, Parks' attorney. The courtroom, of course, was segregated. I walked up the aisle, white people sitting on one side and black people on the other. Found guilty of violating the segregation laws, Parks was given a suspended sentence and fined $10 plus $4 in court fees, equivalent to 140 bus fares. Following her conviction, Attorney Gray filed an appeal, the first step in the plan to challenge bus segregation in federal court. Soon afterwards, Parks lost her job at the Montgomery Fair department store. They never said they fired her because of what she had done, Virginia Durr recalled. What excuse they gave, I don't know, but anyway, they fired her. On the Monday afternoon following Parks's trial, Montgomery's black leaders met again to prepare for the big protest rally scheduled for that evening. It would be decided then whether to continue the bus boycott beyond its first day. When some of the preachers present balked at the idea of challenging Montgomery's powerful white establishment, E.D. Nixon lit into them. "Let me tell you one thing," he began. "You ministers have lived off the sweat of these washerwomen for the last 100 years and ain't never done nothing for them. I am just ashamed of you." He scolded them for acting like cowards, for backing down like little boys. "We've worn aprons all our lives," he continued. "It's time to take the aprons off. If we're going to be men's, now's the time to be men's." King arrived at the meeting while Nixon was speaking, and he was the first to reply. "Brother Nixon, I'm not a coward," he said. "I don't want anybody to call me a coward." After that, the meeting settled down. To help plan the boycott, the ministers agreed to form a new organization, the Montgomery Improvement Association, MIA. After some discussion, they elected King, the newcomer among them, as president of the group. Until now, King hadn't played much of a role in community affairs. He'd wanted to concentrate on getting to know his parishioners and doing a good job at his first church. Recently, he had turned down an invitation to head the local NAACP, and he did not seek the presidency of the new organization. "The vote caught me unawares," he wrote. "It happened so quickly I did not even have time to think it through. It is probable that if I had, I would have declined the nomination." King was the unanimous choice to head the MIA. He had come out strongly in favor of the boycott, and he had demonstrated in his sermons that he was a powerful speaker. Since he hadn't been in town long and wasn't well known beyond his own church, he owed no obligations or debts to the city's black leadership or to its white establishment. Reverend King was a young man, a very intelligent young man, E.D. Nixon recalled. He had not been here long enough for the city fathers to put their hand on him. Usually, they'd find some young man just come to town, pat him on the shoulder, and tell him what a nice church he got. They'd say, "Reverend, your suit don't look so nice to represent the so-and-so Baptist church," and they'd get him a suit. You'd have to watch out for that kind of thing. When the meeting broke up, King rushed home to prepare a speech for that night's mass rally. It would be his first appearance at the newly elected protest leader, and the first time most people in the audience would hear him speak. King wanted to protest the injustices and inhumanities being inflicted on Blacks. As a minister of the gospel, he also wished to express a vision of Christian charity that allowed him to love his fellow man. King had studied the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi and was inspired by the Indian leader's successful use of nonviolent resistance. Gandhi had united the people of India against the colonial rule of England by advocating nonviolence and passive resistance. That is, refusing to cooperate with an unjust system. I had come to see early that the Christian doctrine of love operating through the Gandhian method of nonviolence was one of the most potent weapons available to the Negro in his struggle for freedom, King would later write. These were the thoughts that guided him as he quickly sketched an outline of his speech in his mind. A friend drove King to the Holt Street Baptist Church where the rally was being held. They had to park 3 blocks away and then push their way through the crowds. The church itself holds 4,000 or 5,000 people, Joanne Robinson recalled, but there were thousands of people outside the church that night, They had to put up loudspeakers so they would know what was happening. Joe Asbell, a reporter for the Montgomery Advertiser, also drove to Holt Street, where he was to report on the rally. The Holt Street Baptist Church was probably the most fired up, enthusiastic gathering of human beings that I've ever seen, he remembered. I came down the street and I couldn't believe there were that many cars. I parked many blocks from the church just to get a place for my car. I went on up to the church and they made a way for me because I was the first white person there. I was 2 minutes late and they were already preaching, and that audience was on fire. The preacher would get up and say, "Do you want your freedom?" And they'd say, "Yeah, I want my freedom." I've never heard singing like that. They were on fire for freedom. There was a spirit that no one could capture again. It was so powerful. And then King stood up, and most of them didn't even know who he was. And yet he was a master speaker. The speech that King was about to make would prove to be, he recalled, the most decisive of my life, launching his career as a leader of the nation's civil rights movement. Yet he had little time to prepare and had been possessed by fear, by a feeling of inadequacy, as he took up the pulpit that evening without manuscripts or notes. He looked out upon a church jammed to the rafters. People packed the balcony, stood shoulder to shoulder in the aisles, peered from outside the windows. They had gathered together as American citizens. King began, determined to apply our citizenships to the fullest of its means. King spoke in a deep, resonant voice, his words rolling out with a pulsating rhythmic flow, and then pausing as his audience responded with murmured yeses and amens. "But there comes a time," he cried, the pitch of his voice rising. "There comes a time when people get tired. We are here this evening to say those who have mistreated us so long that we are tired of being segregated and humiliated, tired of being kicked about by the brutal feet of oppression." With that, the murmurs of approval erupted into an explosive roar of shouts and cheers and applause, of feet stomping on the wooden floor, shaking the church walls. "Now, let us say that we are not here advocating violence," King continued. "We have overcome that. The only weapon that we have in our hands this evening is the weapon of protest." They would avoid violence, he said, to set themselves apart from the Ku Klux Klan and the white citizens' councils. "In our protest, there will be no cross burnings. No white person will be taken from his home by a hooded Negro mob and brutally murdered. There will be no threats and intimidation. We are not wrong in what we are doing," King said. "If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. If we are wrong, justice is a lie. And we are determined here in Montgomery to work and fight until justice runs down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. If you will protest courageously," King concluded, "and yet with dignity and Christian love, when the history books are written in future generations, the historians will have to pause and say, there lived a great people, a Black people who injected new meaning and dignity into the veins of civilization. This is our challenge and our overwhelming responsibility." Following King's speech, Rosa Parks was introduced to the crowd. Afterward, the Reverend Ralph Abernathy asked everyone to vote on whether the boycott should continue. "All in favor of the motion stand," he said. Throughout the church, people began to rise until every single person was standing. The cheers broke out again. This mass demonstration of Black pride took the city's white leaders by surprise. Mayor W.A. Gale did not seem to realize that a historic event was taking place. "Comes the first rainy day," Mayor Gale told a friend, "and the Negroes will be back on the buses."